If controls are sort of the heartbeat of MVC, then views are more like the body. They are what the user is going to see. And so a view provides the user interface. And this is very important because for most of your users, the application is the user interface. So even though views may seem incidental to the MVC architecture, they're actually very important because they're how you're going to interact with your users. Typically, these are HTML. One thing to keep in mind is that these views are not directly accessed by files. So this is a huge difference between, say, MVC and web forms. The URL does not look for a file on the server and pull it up. The URL gets passed to a controller, which fires an action, and that action looks for the appropriate view to serve up. So it's important to keep in mind that even though views are files, that we are not directly accessing those files from the web server. The controller is going to provide the view, and it's going to provide the data in the form of the model that's going to populate that view. So I want to take a quick look at what a view looks like. Generally speaking, if we're following the MVC conventions, these are going to be in the Views folder, and they're going to be in a subfolder that has the same name of the controller that serves those views up. Now, you don't have to follow this convention, but it does save you a lot of work if you do. So if I'm in the Home folder, so these views are going to be served up by the Home controller, and I pull up, for instance, about.cshtml. This is a file, but keep in mind the URL is not going to ask for this file. It's going to ask for an action on the controller, and that action will decide which view to serve up. So this is what the view looks like. Notice it's basically HTML, and here and there you have a little bit of Razor code. So here's some Razor code that writes out some values from the view bag. Here's some Razor code that are HTML helpers that create hyperlinks. And when this view is served up, the server will actually interpret this code, put in the data, create the hyperlinks, do whatever it needs to do, and then return the final HTML result back to the user. Now, this particular view is relatively simple. In fact, you can have views that are completely static. They're just HTML. But if I go to a more complex view, say the account view, and let's say I go to register, hey, this is a little bit different. Here we have a model that's been bound to the view. So the controller is actually going to populate this model and tie it to this view so that when this view displays and it makes this form, it's going to use properties from those models to populate itself. So that's what we're looking at when we are looking at a view, and the end result, I can fire this up, and I'll just use the About page, the About view we were looking at. If I go over here to About, the end result is just simply static HTML. If I view the source, you can see I get nice, clean, static HTML back from my view. So we know that we can have a multitude of views, and these views are kind of analogous to web forms or web pages. But how does the controller know how to find the right view? So the controller fires off an action. It's looking for a view to serve up. How does this get found? Well, there's a few different pieces that go into finding the right view. One is the MVC framework expects a conventional folder naming structure. So out of the box, it expects to look for views in the Views folder and then in a subfolder that has the same name as the controller that serves those views. So if you're following this conventional folder naming structure, then most actions can find the views simply by using the action name. By default, if I have an action called About, then when it returns a view, it's going to look in the subfolder for that controller underneath the Views folder, and it's going to look for a view that's called about.cshtml. You can also actually specify the view name, which sometimes people like to do it explicitly just for clarity. Sometimes people will do it because the view names and the action names may not match up directly. Finally, if you need to, you can specify the full path to your view. which is something that we normally want to avoid, but occasionally you will want to do this, especially if you might use the same view for several different controllers and several different actions. I'm looking at the home controller. This is the default controller generated whenever you create a new MVC Internet project. Visual Studio will make this controller for you. And you'll notice that this is the home controller, and it has 3 different actions: index, about, and contact, all of which return a view. Now in this particular case, you notice that the view has no other information, and that's because for these 3 views we are following the conventions that the MVC frameworks expect. If I come over here to the Views folder, here's a subfolder called Home, and in it are the views with the same name as the actions: About, Contact, and Index. So when those particular actions on the controller fire, like Index for example, it's going to look in this folder, go down to the controller folder, and find the view that has the same name as the action. So that's all the wiring up that needs to happen. However, that's not our only option. For example, if the views were different, let's say I add a new view here. Not a very exciting view. And I wanted, say, the index to return that view. All I would have to do is specify the name. And that's all I need to do. I don't want to put the file extension on here or anything like that, just the name, because once again the framework is still expecting certain conventions. It's still expecting to look in the home folder, and it's still expecting to find a view that has this name. So I don't have to do anything special other than that. And sometimes, and I tend to do this, even if I could just leave the view method blank, I will go ahead and put the view name in there anyway, just to be explicitly clear about the view that it's returning, but you don't have to. The last thing you can do is, if nothing's following a convention, you do have the option of actually specifying the view path. So I can use the tilde, which puts me in my application root. I can specify the views folder, and now I can go pretty much anywhere I want. In this particular case, I do have to specify the file extension because now I'm overriding all the conventions of the MVC framework. I am giving it a literal location to look in. It doesn't have to be in the views folder. It could be anywhere in my application structure, and so I do have to provide a file extension for that case. But it does show you that I can be as flexible with the views as I want to be. One of the ways that a controller and a view can pass data back and forth between them is using the viewData and the viewBag objects. ViewData is a dictionary of values that gets shared between the views and controllers. ViewData also uses named keys. Now, if you've used collections before in .NET, then you're kind of familiar with the way this mechanism works. ViewData is a collection, it's a dictionary, so you can refer to ViewData and then use the square brackets, your key name, and then set it equal to some object. Now we don't normally do that, but I'll get to that in a minute. But I just want to point out that since ViewData is a dictionary, you can access it and use it just like any other dictionary in the .NET framework. In this way, it's very similar to the session object for those of you that might be coming from a classic ASP or the web forms background. ViewBag is a typed interface into the ViewData dictionary. So you don't see a lot of people using the ViewData dictionary directly. It's way more common to see people using the ViewBag. But it's important to note that really the ViewBag is just it's a cover, it's a facade, it's an interface over the actual ViewData. So ultimately everything ends up using that ViewData dictionary regardless of what you do. It's just most people find ViewBag to be an easier and more intuitive way to work with this collection than to work with the collection directly. And there's nothing special you have to do to wire it up. Whatever values you put into the ViewBag are accessible from both the controller and the view. I'm here looking at the default home controller, And you'll notice that each of these actions put a piece of information into the view bag. In this case, they've called it message. And what's going to happen is these views will actually use the viewBag message property. So, for instance, here it's just viewBag.message, and this can be anything you want. It's not like message is a preset viewBag property or anything. And they put a string in there. When I look at the about view, notice right here is where I write that message out. So if I actually fire this guy up, notice the message here is your app description page. Fire this guy up and I open about, here's that code, your app description page. So if I put some other value here in the view bag, the message changes. Okay, no big deal there. But you can easily add anything you want to the view bag. So for instance, I could do something like viewBag dot, whatever. And it doesn't have to be a string. It can be any type of data. It can even be other objects. It can even be other model objects if I wanted to. Anything that I want to store temporarily like this, I can put here. And then in my view, I can access that. So how about for this first paragraph? I'm just going to use the viewBag about text. All right, load this guy up. And there he is. So the view bag is a really easy thing to use. Now, if for some reason I was having issues with that, or I just found the view data model more intuitive, that just looks like this. And I would refer to it in my view the exact same way. I would take this and use that instead of the viewBag.about text. So you can see the two statements are very, very similar. It's just most people find this a little bit easier to use, and you will see this much more commonly than you'll see a reference to view data directly.